everyone. Welcome to the debate. I'm your host, Sana Makbul, with you at BTV World. In today's show, we will be talking about two very important stories. The first is, of course, with what is going on at home, especially in terms of what the PTI chairman and the former Prime Minister had been continuously saying since his ouster earlier this year. The fact that the US is behind a conspiracy, and because of that, there is the so-called important government right now in power. And this is something that he wants to challenge and rally against, and has been part of the narrative and the force behind which the PTI has been gaining its popularity and its followers. But unfortunately, we have seen that yet again there has been a change in the statement from Mr. Khan, and what he now claims is that it has passed him and that he has put it behind the particular issue of the US-led conspiracy in Pakistan. The main reason behind why all of his narrative was put forward and why this long march is happening, why he has talked about the institutions' involvement within politics, and of course talked about the fact that the current government has been planted and that his ouster was backed by foreign elements. All of this has now been put behind by the former Prime Minister. And this, of course, is something which is quite worrisome and concerning in terms of the kind of political advantage that the PTI gained because of this narrative, which apparently now is not much of a concern to Mr. Khan. This is what we're going to be taking a look at in our first segment of the show today, something, of course, that the Information Minister, also the Prime Minister and others have talked about and said that show the true face of the PTI chairman, and they have emphasized the fact that his personal political gains have been more important to him than Pakistan's national interests. And that on the basis of the relations that Pakistan has with its international countries is what the former Prime Minister had played upon, and because of which the country, of course, had suffered. So bigger question marks, of course, remain in terms of where exactly have those claims gone, why is there a change of statement, and who's going to now be talking about all the previous months in which this was the main problem that the PTI chairman seemed to have with the current situation, and now has been put past him. So this is what is the first segment of the show going to be about. The next one is going to take a look at the very important meeting between the US president and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali. And this is, of course, a very, very important meeting, especially with reference to the kind of relations that the US and China seem to have been experiencing in the recent past, and also because it's the first one-to-one meeting since Joe Biden has taken office, and also the first between the US and Chinese leadership since before the COVID-19 era. And when we take a look, of course, at the kind of issues that have been discussed, some very important red lines, as Joe Biden has described them, have been talked about, including Taiwan. Something that, of course, became an issue between the two countries back in August when the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. So this is, of course, an important meeting. It's a 3-hour-long meeting, and various important issues were discussed within this. But the important aspect of opening and remaining open the communication lines is an important one. But we're going to, of course, take a look at what this means in terms of the kind of dynamic that will now flow, and eventually what sort of a follow-up will be of this particular meeting and how it's going to impact the dynamic between China and the US, and of course the impact that that is going to have on the way that different countries around the world will interact. That is going to be our focus in the second segment of the show today. For this and more, as always, we've been joined in the studios by senior analysts Farooq Patafi and Raja Faisal, and we've also been joined online by Mr. Raza Ahmed Rumi, senior journalist, and also Mr. Hanan Hussain, also senior journalist. Thank you very much for joining us and being a part of the debate. Let me start with you, Raza Saab. Considering, of course, what we have experienced for so many months now in terms of what Imran Khan has talked about, a lot of it has been based on the foundation of a US-led conspiracy, something that he has reiterated every chance he's got in the previous many months and talked about quite openly. And now we see that this particular statement has seen a shift in his recent interview with the Financial Times, where he spoke about the fact that this is now behind him. What sort of a question mark does this put on all the previous statements that have come out from the PTI's leadership that have been pointed out by the PTI chairman, the kind of evidence that he has waved in front of crowds, what he has said in terms of institutions' involvement, and of course the current government as well, and whether or not this disintegrates his entire argument?
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here. Well, first of all, I think what Mr. Khan has done is nothing new. In Pakistan's history, such populist stance has been used and exploited by politicians. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto did this really effectively in the 1970s. He also considered the US as somehow responsible for the PNA movement against him that brought that led to the martial law of 1977, and later on in his writings, etc., he also cited the U.S. as the enemy of an independent Pakistan and the kind of country he was trying to make. And so Imran Khan has taken directly that particular line, since his ouster from the office. In fact, prior to that, he had started this whole narrative on the U.S. conspiracy, which sadly there was no evidence because the national security institutions, the Foreign Office, all other responsible government authorities who looked at this issue could not find any kind of evidence. But that doesn't really matter in the court of public opinion. The message has gone through. His supporters think that Imran Khan was ousted by by a US-led conspiracy, and I think it's a smart strategy, given that there is a genuine anti-Americanism in certain sections of Pakistani society because of the troubled history Pakistan has with the US over the last seven
Yeah.
decades or so. But the problem is that the implications of such a narrative are really damaging and dangerous, considering that Pakistan is still dependent on Western financial institutions for bailouts. It is also, in a way, dependent on the Western countries for many of the defense equipment and supplies. So that makes it difficult for the future Pakistan governments to have a productive relationship with the superpower. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Right. Mr. Hanan, considering, of course, the way that we have seen over the years, this anti America sentiment being something that has been utilized by many political parties and various political leadership, we can understand where this entire narrative is coming from. But the kind of sentiment that was earlier described by the PTI leadership, backing it with so called evidence that wasn't really shared, and then, of course, the kind of popularity and followers that the PTI seems to gain because of this particular narrative point to huge question marks in terms of the kind of political gains that the PTI enjoyed because of this that suddenly has now been put past them. When we take a look at, of course, the kind of damage that this potentially has had on US Pakistan relationship, of course, that is something that it was a huge cost to pay for personal political gains. And that may be something that has sold in the past as well. But what do we make of the current statement coming in from the PTI leadership in the context of the kind of followers that the PTI leadership enjoys, and whether or not there should be any accountability in terms of what was earlier said and what is now being said?
Thank you, Sana. I think there absolutely should be accountability. Part of PDI's narrative and their assumption has been that they could just prop up and manufacture this narrative about the U.S. kind of, hatching up this conspiracy, and of course, the National Security Committee itself could not find any evidence for it. So to give it a pass and say, okay, this is just going to operate within the ambit of populism, is to ignore all that the PDI appears to be putting in the way of damaging these relations. We saw back in September the current government, even though it had been, a relatively early time coming in, their prospects of a reset, of a reoriented U.S.-Pakistan relationship was received well in Washington. And that kind of sentiment is important because you've got financial dependencies on the U.S., and the U.S. also sees a stable Pakistan as central to its goals in a region which is no longer prioritized on the same grounds that Pakistan and the U.S. have had in the past. But I think this particular statement to say, okay, I've moved beyond it, as Prime Minister Imran Khan implies in the statement. Well, it wasn't his call to make. The signal that you're sending out, let's just not have any two signals about it. It is clear that the PDI leadership, when it came to extracting political mileage, giving the impression of an unstable Pakistan, was all well and good to go with this regime change conspiracy. But now, when it seems opportune, okay, let's just change the tone a bit and then signal that we've been working towards it. Well, not a lot has been put in the way of developing that relationship. So I strongly believe there should be accountability, and the current government's narrative to not let the PDI government walk away with this is one that may not stick with the public at present, but it does strike a really, really strong chord with what needs to happen in this country to hold such leadership accountable.
Yeah.
Right,
Raza,
absolutely. And let me go to Farooq Faisal and we'll come back to your question. Farooq, earlier you pointed out among the many interviews that the PTI chairman gave that he's not no longer mentioning the talk of US conspiracy anymore, and you notice that. And then, of course, now we see that this is a statement that has come out from the PTI chairman himself now. Do you think that this is something that has been a deliberate decision of the PTI chairman and the former Prime Minister in terms of actually moving away from this particular narrative, which perhaps may not be suiting them anymore? And why is that?
Thank you very much for noticing that I have been saying this all along. But let me actually talk about this question. I think you're absolutely on the money. It is a very conscious, decision to shift narrative and to actually present an alternative narrative that needs to be there. PTI, just for the sake of record, let me also say that today Imran Khan Saab and Shireen Mazari both were saying that they were being misconstrued and that their comment amounted to something else. I kept on reading and rereading this text, this interview, interview, and I could not find any other meaning. I think it was very clear. Either you can fight a conspiracy or you can claim that there is no conspiracy and it is behind me. So at this moment, there has been a shift. And because PTI keeps on saying that you have to offer only constructive criticism, let me offer some. I've been constantly saying from day one that Imran Khan Saab is doing the wrong thing by actually including this kind of narrative into his victimhood narrative. Why? Because even if you are ousted from power, that should have been good enough a narrative, because in this country you have this checkered history of democracy. But he had to go forward and include the US into this. And the assumption at that time seemed to be that there is going to be a midterm election in the US, and perhaps the president or the US is going to further weaken, and then he can get away with whatever he wants. Because then there was this idea that perhaps Donald Trump can be made the Speaker of US House, and then after that anything can happen. That didn't happen. The problem with Imran Khan Saab is that he had a lot of credibility. His own personal stock was really huge, even when he was removed from power. But he has been actually throwing it away. Instead of doing all this, had he actually stuck to his own performance, especially when it comes to health card, when it comes to poverty alleviation and umpteen other initiatives, he could have actually garnered the kind of attention and support he needed. But he had to listen to the people like whom we know. For example, there was an audio leak about Arsalan Beta, and we know that advice was essentially linked to this. Because of this, today Imran Khan Saab remains high and dry, and I don't think that he is going to have the kind of impact he thought that he is going to have in Pakistani politics.
Yeah. Sana, I
Yes,
would like to go towards Raza Rumi with your permission. Obviously, he has highlighted the excellent points, and one of them is that, of course, we have a history of the political parties using this narrative, and it is considered as a smart move. Obviously, always using mantras against US to get votes within our people, and it really works along really well. But when we look at the obviously the current situation, we very well know that a couple of months ago, if we talk about our defense relations with America, of course, we had very positive statements coming out from the American side, plus the sustainment deal of $450 million that actually sort of sustained our F-16s. In this whole context, can we say, Raza, that in future somehow we have to put an end to this kind of politics, that any political party should never be allowed to go along these lines that are maybe serving their own party narratives or maybe serving the individuals, but when it comes to national interest, of course it is quite diminishing towards our national interest, and they should be put an end to it. And obviously Pakistan's election commission can play a key role in it.
And Raza Sahab, I want to complicate the situation for you further by adding a question. I promise I will be briefer than I was in my comment. Let me ask you about personal stock of Imran Khan Sahab. We saw that in the past when he talked about 35 puncture or 35 punctures, at that time it kind of hurt him because it affected his credibility. Now this U-turn this time, is it going to affect his personal stock as well?
Thank you so much. Good to meet my friend Farooq virtually, and
Same here.
Faisal,
Same
see
here.
you.
Thank you.
I think, look, the first thing is, I think, Faisal, what you have raised is a very important issue, and that is of national interest. You see, Farooq cited the case of 35 punctures when in 2013 election, Imran Khan said that 35 seats had been rigged by the PMLN, and Najam Sethi was involved in it, and then later on he apologized, and he backtracked and said that was a political statement. Similarly, he has said other things. For example, I don't know if you guys remember, he even accused the current Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif of offering him 10 billion rupees as a bribe to quit politics. And Shehbaz Sharif went to the court, and the case is still pending in one of the courts, by the way. So much for defamation laws in Pakistan. But the thing is that this issue of American conspiracy and targeting the West and riling up public opinion against the West is very damaging for Pakistan's national interest. There are certain relationships that Pakistani state has always maintained since the 1950s, and the relationship with the US is a key relationship. I mean, it is a defense and security related relationship, but it is also a very vital economic relationship because the US is the largest destination for Pakistan's exports. And it is the second largest source of remittances in the country that come and keep our economy afloat. So it is damaging when you do this. Now imagine tomorrow, I mean, of course, the US did not take these allegations seriously, but if there's a Trump-like character in the US who hears this thing and he says, well, I'm going to, fix you guys, uh, this is not going to be in Pakistan's interest. And Imran Khan is just any politician. So I think that Imran Khan should be advised by his party. I believe that, in his recent discussions with the establishment, the messages has been passed on to him that, if he wants to come back into power at some point, because he would have to amend some of his statements as well as his attitudes and not be so irresponsible. And I think that's why they hired a lobbying firm. That's why he's now quietly and gradually backtracking from his earlier conspiracy narrative, because he knows that, as a statesman, as a prime minister in waiting, any opposition leader is a prime minister in waiting. He cannot afford such a to harm the national interest. Now, about his personal stock, Farooq, I personally think it won't really matter because you and I can sit here and debate. But his hardcore loyalist constituency does not really care.
No, but
They will say
his loyalist constituency never won him an election. It was the
that's
undecided who actually were voting for him and have been
yeah.
voting for him. Is it not going to have an impact on them?
It really depends on what is the how far the communication strategy of the current parties in power are effective. So far, unfortunately, they have not been very effective. That's why Imran Khan's narrative it has reached the sky limits, It has penetrated into the Pakistani mind through WhatsApp groups, through social media, Facebook, Twitter, and every person. Yeah, I'm speaking from the U.S. The Pakistanis here, overseas Pakistanis, they also believe that the American government has conspired against Imran Khan with the
Yes.
and have found local Mir Jafars. I'm not I'm not joking. I've spoken to
Yes,
at least
absolutely.
50 people. You know, so it's a very effective propaganda that has gone on. Sadly, the I have to say that the ruling coalition is not really either countering it or does not have the I don't know that does not want to or does not have the
Right.
capacity. So it really depends on how they manage it. Yes.
Right. Mr. Hanan, earlier we talked about accountability, and of course, in terms of what should happen or how this particular issue should be countered with, of course, there's a lot in terms of the kind of consequence that there needs to be or any sort of action. But we've seen that perhaps even before a lot of the things that came out, including the audio leaks or other references in the past that have been made without any evidence, they have just gone by and they were forgotten eventually, and there's not much in terms of its impact on the popularity of the PTI chairman that has had any impact. So when we take a look at, of course, there is one way to go about it in terms of any sort of legal action or accountability that could be done from a political leader. Even if that is the case, perhaps it doesn't have much value in terms of the kind of popularity in terms of the voters that the PTI leadership enjoys. And if we were to then move on to the way that the people are now going to be taking in this information, it seems that again, as the PTI chairman and other PTI leaders keep talking about being misunderstood, this is perhaps something that's also justification given by their followers. How exactly do we counter the kind of propaganda earlier that Mr. Raza was talking about, or the kind of belief that there exists in terms of whatever is being fed to the nation by political leadership as being is true? And then, of course, the fact that the retention is also so small of any action or any event that eventually it is forgotten.
And
And
Hanan, very quick question. Do you think Imran Khan Sahab also has the tendency to get exploited by others?
And Hanan, let me pile on it.
Lucky day.
Luckily, it's your lucky day.
Yeah.
Hanan, being a journalist, how do you see the performance of the other parties, not the PTI, but the other parties, their social media teams, as very beautifully highlighted by Raza earlier, that they have actually failed to propagate properly and bring in sort of social media teams that can work really well. Do you think that this is the case, and they have failed to obviously bring in the counter narratives?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I'll start with the social media angle. I think it should be treated as a subset of a strategy, but not the entire strategy. Because you see, the reason why the ruling coalition is trying to kind of make its name as far as it comes to rebuilding relationships and also gaining traction against Khan's narrative is because they want to establish a different standard of leadership and communication from Khan. So both of them are kind of involved in this endless cycle of a U.S. conspiracy or not when there is no evidence for it, then what distinguishes one from the other? So I think social media teams, there's a strong need to, for example, use smart tactics such as sentiment analysis to kind of get a sense of, okay, what kind of a narrative or a spin kind of resonates with the people and what they need to be informed about it. Because Prime Minister Imran Khan, a former Prime Minister, cannot be trusted with doing that. That's one dynamic that we've seen. Coming back to how do we counter it as a whole, I think you need to focus on the core of the matter. So the core of the matter is, why is Prime Minister Imran Khan going with this U.S. narrative? I don't think it's going to be swept under the carpet so easily. Fundamentally, because this was kind of like an overarching theme of Khan's, political campaigning. A voters of confidence, constitutionally recognized, doesn't go against him, doesn't go in his favor. He goes against with the U.S. narrative. Now, when it comes to rebuilding this relationship, I think there's a strong need, which has also been highlighted by the government, to make the people understand how consequential these things are. U.S. is directly tied to certain interests that affect the common people. We talked about financial stability before. We talked about the defense as well. And I think there's a fundamental, I'd say, challenge for the Khan leadership as well. If it wants to be elected, based on popular vote, is it really standing up for national interests? I think that's the angle where the coalition can build on. because we've seen the armed forces maintain the defense linkages very effectively. We've seen the government make the case for restoration. What has Prime Minister Khan done? And whenever it seems politically opportune, he backtracks. So I think Mr. Imran Khan is going to kind of give everything a spin, whatever narrative you put forward. So I won't say you want to contain it or counter it as per statement to statement. What you want to do is build on the holes where Imran Khan sticks to this narrative and why does he backtrack, the electability angle of it. And he's basically misled the people, and I think that's where the government can build.
Right, absolutely. And we're going to try and reconnect with Mr. Raza as well. But Farooq, I have a quick question for you from what you asked earlier to Mr. Hanan. Of course, there's a lot of talk in terms of the advisors to the ex-Prime Minister and the way that he's being guided. And that may be so. But in terms of the kind of leadership that any country requires, can we really afford a leader who perhaps is only as good as his advisors?
Right. And earlier you were asking a question about accountability as well, right? So you are absolutely on the money. Once again, you are totally correct that actions have consequences, and if a leader makes bad choices, nobody is going to talk about their advisor. It is going to be their decision that they actually mainstream those ideas, which might be outliers. And I think that that kind of consequence is going to continue there, being there with Imran Khan Saab. Remember, his two attacks, one on the US, the other on Pakistan's own establishment. It gives you this impression that he is somehow a loose cannon. That was something that was supposed to be fixed by 4 years in government. But now that impression is back. And everybody, everywhere we go, even PTI's own people actually claim that he doesn't listen to their advice, and that he is behaving like a loose cannon. The biggest problem is that then who is he listening to? One, we have already indicated at Salan Beta wall angle. That is a very important angle because it is thought that his decline started because of one person, one unelected person's advice, and her emphasis on spirituality and other factors which are out of domain of policy making. Then, of course, certain allies that he kept on hinting at, within the establishment, and that's why he ended up alienating so many people. So if he wants to, first of all, actually correct that image, he'll have to ensure that he gets rid of those advisors. If he doesn't, what exactly does it mean? That means that he doesn't want to correct at all. And tomorrow, once again, the same people with same might can exploit him.
Absolutely, and we really hope that is not the case, but that's all that we have from this segment. But I'd just also quickly request Mr. Raza Rumi and Mr. Hanan to stay with us for the next segment as well. Welcome back to the debate. We're now going to be talking about our second segment, which is going to focus on the very important meeting between the US president and his counterpart in China on the sidelines of the G20 summit. And this is, of course, important not only because this is the first meeting between the two countries after a very, very long time, the first since Biden has assumed office, but also in terms of course, the kind of tensions that both countries' relationship has faced in the recent past, and the way, of course, that these dynamics influence the international relations all around the world. So that is going to be our focus in the second segment today. We have with us for this segment as well Mr. Raza Ahmed Rumi and Mr. Hanan Hussain with us, and we're going to be, of course, trying to analyze exactly what this dynamic will hold for the future. Farooq, when we consider, of course, the US-China relationship is very important to us as well, and then, of course, in terms of the way the entire world looks at this particular dynamic. And since recently, of course, there have been a lot of spike in tensions. There have been numerous incidents, including back in August with the US speaker visiting Taiwan, that have raised these tensions. But apparently, it seems in this meeting, the kind of statements that have come out after a very long meeting, one, that very important issues were discussed, and two, that the channel of communications have been decided to be open. How positive of a development is this in terms of the kind of a situation we'll see in the future and the way that we've seen previous engagements? Is this something markedly different or more encouraging?
Right, Sana, it is a very fascinating, question, because let me tell you, this was their, in person, the first meeting since President Biden actually took over, but they have been meeting virtually. That essentially means that they are going to actually have video calls, and they will be sitting in front of the entire, staff. Usually you don't have that kind of personal magic. But President Biden is not, a stranger to President Xi. In fact, the relationship is pretty long, and President Biden actually boasts about having spent somewhere around 65 hours with President Xi when he was vice president, when he was a senator as well. And at this moment, it seems that both sides were bolstered by two things. One, COVID is almost gone, and now you can have the kind of personal meetings as well. The second fact is that President Xi is also running hard after his new mandate that he got. And President Biden, everybody was thinking that he's going to become a lame duck president because he will lose control of the entire US Congress. That did not happen. So now both are very confident and they can build bridges. My concern at this moment is that there are too many spoilers, too many people who want to, for the both countries to actually, break their relationship, break up their relationship and decouple. That is not going to happen. And the worst possible thing for the future of this country, the world, is that not China being an adversary, but in a world economy, a China-shaped hole, when China has totally fallen out of the system. So at this moment, they will remain competitors, and they are, but they will also not, remove any further cooperations that they might have.
Yeah,
Right.
Sana, with your permission,
let me just
Raza.
quickly go to Raza Saab, and Faisal, you may add to that, because I think we only have time for one question since he has to leave soon. But Raza Saab, considering, of course, that one major topic of contention between the two countries was the issue of Taiwan, especially since August, and we have seen that repeatedly there were statements coming in from the US's side saying that the US support exists for Taiwan in case of any situation. But now what Joe Biden has said is that it's clear to the US that there is no imminent attempt on part of China to invade Taiwan, and that his policy remains the same, and there has been no change in that. This is something that has been discussed between the two leaders, and President Xi Jinping has also emphasized on the fact that this is something that the US needs to be clear upon. What do you make of these statements, considering what the US has said earlier and what it is saying now, and the fact that when we look at previous statements, it seems that there was perhaps very outright support in terms of what is going on in Taiwan, but now the US is saying that there is no change. Do you see any contradiction, or is there none?
And Raza, with your permission, I'll want to add in. Obviously, we know that in East China Sea and South China Sea, Americans, with help of their alliances, of course, I'm talking about AUKUS and Quad, they are putting pressure on China because their presence in shape of AUKUS and Quad, one of them, of course, is a military alliance. They are putting pressure on China. Do you see any different future of these two alliances? Because in one of them alliance, India is involved in it as well. Any change in it, or you think that they would remain as it is as a deterrent for China?
Yeah, thank you. That's these are quite a few questions. I think I will, try and address this through the major, strategic and policy discussions that have been underway in the United States. And as you know, as you already have noted, that many experts here, many observers here have warned of an impending a new Cold War, which is beginning to take shape between the United States and China. With China being the rising power, there's more and more pressure by the U.S. Policy circles to somehow undo or minimize the Chinese threat, as they call it. And so this is an unfortunate development which we are seeing unfolding. How far it goes, whether it turns into a Cold War of the 20th century or not, I mean, it remains to be seen. But definitely that is where the United States is moving towards. And there is a bipartisan consensus on that. It is not that the Democrats have a different view on China than Republicans. Both the parties, and there's a consensus, and in some part this is also driven by the military industrial complex that actually runs the United States, because they a lot of defense industries production, they need constant sales and constant involvement and engagement and influence on policy. So I think that's the larger context that we are seeing. As regards the Taiwanese issue, I think there the United States has had a position for very long. And I don't see why that would change given the rise of Chinese power, because that is something that the US has used as a leverage in the past and is now using it as even more to kind of push back China on the global scene. I think on your question, Faisal, it's more of a deterrent. It is more of the threat of confrontation or conflict that is being aired, rather than a real possibility of a conflict. However, I personally think that this U.S.-Chinese rivalry, or whatever claim for power, is not going to turn into a full-scale Cold War, and largely because this is a different kind of a world that we are living in. The economic interdependence of countries, including the US and China, is so immense and it's so intricate that the US would not cross a particular line. Because if it does that, there will be severe economic consequences, as you can see what Europe is currently facing with regard to Ukraine, with regard to gas supplies, high energy prices, etc., all the mayhem and political chaos that is taking place in Europe. Imagine if that were to happen in the US. I think no US administration would want that to happen. Yeah,
Right,
I'll
absolutely.
stop here.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Raza Ahmed Rumi, for joining us and being a part of the debate. I believe you have today, but thank you very much for joining us in the session. And let me just go to Mr. Hanan now. Considering, of course, that there is this conversation of economic interdependence, very important, of course, for the entire world, considering the times that we're living in and what Raza Saab was talking about. But we have seen that there was a blow to the economic and bilateral relationship between the US and China as well. And this is, of course, something that has been discussed in this meeting too. But how soon can we see both the countries overcoming these issues towards moving towards the sort of trade relations that could potentially impact the economy of both the countries and the entire world? Because, of course, when we take a look at the statements, there is a lot of talk of moving away from conflict and moving towards a positive engagement. But what sort of a pace are we looking at in terms of that actually happening, considering the times that we're living in?
And if we have time, let
Yes.
me also sneak in a question regarding the importance, Hanan, of G20 itself. How do you see it actually shaping up the future policy discussions?
Thank you. So let's start with the G20 question. I think G20's role is pronounced. One of the reasons why is because it is not what China has said in the past to be a privileged club of democracies that do not have broad-based participation. We see that the G20 has also been involved in the debt service suspension initiative, which is planned for developing countries, has had the backing from China. So those kind of supports using economic might to cater to developing countries' needs is something that the G20 can come forward on. It has its constraints because the consensus is difficult to match, especially with this rivalry gathering pace from the sidelines. But it's not to say that the G20 cannot deliver in the world's interest should this relationship have some sort of guardrails. Coming towards Sana, your point, I'd like to make a distinction here. Now, if you look at the White House readout for the meeting, United States, Biden hasn't budged away from the concerns which China has taken to be red lines. China has called out the use for interference in its internal affairs. The U.S., of course, is under increasing pressure because it has just upgraded its economic strategic partnership with Southeast Asia, and that is a bloc called ASEAN, which U.S. holds very dearly. And ASEAN has been complaining from time to time that, look, U.S. actions in the Taiwan Strait, which is the Taiwan and the China corridor, create the risk for conflict. So, what is the U.S. doing to minimize that? And I think we've seen a lot of pragmatism from China. This is a win from China because from time to time, China has said, okay, we have what the U.S. calls to be great competition. How is the U.S. going to manage this rivalry? You had prior meetings, for example, one in Alaska, where the Chinese were, sound enough to come forward to the U.S. and talk about issues, but the U.S. just wanted to bash China away. And we see the cost coming in because the rhetoric is just not coming forward. I'd like to remind that, China has been looking for guardrails on this relationship. So how do we manage this rivalry so that the region that we're in is not subject to, let's say, nuclear hysteria or, for example, economic decoupling, because China is so vastly integrated and U.S. has its own diplomatic linkages that China was saying, okay, are you looking to the future? This meeting is kind of a sign that the countries can come together and talk. Does that mean that the U.S. is going to give up what China sees as its interference over the one China policy? That would be a huge cost for Biden to make domestically. So I think a lot of tensions remain, just that they can be tempered. So this is signaling to regional alliances to say, we got you covered.
Absolutely. Faisal, of course, the US-China relationship is also very important to Pakistan. And of course, the impact that that's going to have on the way that we'll manage both the relationships is also something that we'll need to see. And so this positive development is something that Pakistan welcomes. But when we look at the kind of red lines that have been discussed or that have existed between the two in the past as well, how exactly would you think Pakistan will be able to navigate this?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question, and I think for Pakistan, both of the countries, they are very important. As Farooq earlier in the earlier phase mentioned that, of course, Pakistan's biggest, exports, they go to America, number one.
And number two,
Raza did, I guess. Both of you are genius. So one of the genius actually mentioned it earlier. And if it comes to China, of course, we have CPEC going on with China, and with China, we have a brotherly relation since the day one. So Pakistan is at a very, tricky junction where Pakistan has to balance it very, professionally, and we are doing it so far. And we must never forget that whenever there was an odd time between US and China in terms of their bilateral relations, Pakistan played a pivotal role, and I think in coming future as well, we can play an excellent role, and that's how it should be. We should always keep a balance. Here, Sana, I wanted to quickly mention one fact, and that is that the whole thing which is going on right now, of course, US wants to have a normalized relations with China at this moment. It has a lot to do with whatever is happening in Ukraine, because they know that in recent times, especially earlier this year, when President Putin, he visited Beijing, he met with President Xi, and they increased their bilateral trade from $117.6 billion to $200 billion. Right. That gave an economic cushion to Russia to go along with their own adventures, which they are straight away, they started doing it. So to me, I think US wants to normalize relations with China because they further want to alienate obviously Russia for Ukraine. So that is what it is going on, and I think they will
Right,
be
okay.
successful.
Right, yes,
Right.
Farooq, very quickly.
Very,
yes.
very quickly, we South Asians have this habit of obsessing about one part of the entire game, right? And continuously talking about that. I think G20 summit this time is very important because it has many moving parts. One part is Lavrov's presence there. You know, Western media started saying that he's
Heart
ill
attack.
and had a heart checkup, but then he gave an interview in which he's donning his shorts and actually talking to the media that I'm okay. And similarly, the meetings include Saudi, Prime Minister and his interactions as well. You know that recently there was exchange of hot words regarding OPEC Plus's decision to cut back production of crude oil. So I think at that time everybody was thinking that President Biden is going to be a lame duck. But now that he is back, I think it is going to have a very interesting kind of communication strategies coming forward,
Right.
and we are going to look at that. as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much,
Tricky
Mr.
times.
Hanan Hussain, for joining us. Thank you, Farooq. Thank you, Faisal,
Thank you.
for being a part of the debate and taking our show right to the very end. But that's all that we have from the debate. We'll see you tomorrow.